In the grand tapestry of Tudor history woven with kings, consorts, battles, and betrayals, the Dowager Queens are often little more than faint silhouettes in the background, their influence overshadowed by louder, more visible figures. Yet behind the crown, behind the thrones and the thunder of royal decrees, these royal widows worked with remarkable skill and quiet determination to shape the destiny of England. Far from fading into obscurity after the deaths of their husbands, they stepped into roles of subtle but profound power. They forged alliances, guided future monarchs, preserved dynastic continuity, and anchored the realm during times of uncertainty. Their strategies were not marked by war banners or public spectacle, but by letters, marriages, patronage, and faith, tools wielded not in the open glare of court drama, but in the enduring shadows where true legacies are often born. To overlook the Dowager Queens is to miss one of the most compelling chapters in the story of Tudor England. How women, once presumed finished, quietly rewrote the rules of influence and changed the course of history. In Tudor England, amid the glittering courts, political intrigues, and the larger-than-life monarchs who dominate the historical stage, there existed a group of women who are rarely given center stage in the traditional narratives: the Dowager Queens. These were the widowed queens consort who, upon the death of their royal husbands, did not disappear into the background but often continued to influence court politics, royal successions, and foreign diplomacy. Though not ruling monarchs themselves, Dowager Queens played essential roles behind the scenes, exerting significant social, familial, and occasionally political power. Their impact is frequently underrepresented in the retellings of Tudor history, yet a closer inspection reveals that they were pivotal figures whose presence shaped the course of events in meaningful ways. The Dowager Queen's role was defined largely by her previous position as queen consort and the relationships she cultivated during her husband's reign. Once widowed, she retained the status of queen, but her formal political role often became ambiguous. However, ambiguity did not equate to irrelevance. Rather, it allowed for a different type of influence, less visible, less formally recognized, but no less important. These women were not merely passive relics of a previous reign. On the contrary, they became mentors, protectors of dynastic legitimacy, political advisors, and cultural patrons. Their power lay in their experience, their networks, and the symbolic weight of their former position. To ignore their stories is to overlook a critical aspect of Tudor political and familial structure. One of the earliest examples in Tudor history is Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV and the mother of Elizabeth of York. Though Elizabeth Woodville belonged more fully to the preceding era, the Wars of the Roses, her influence bled directly into the formation of the Tudor dynasty. After Edward IV's death in 1483, her marriage and children were declared invalid by Richard III, who seized the throne. Elizabeth was forced into sanctuary with her daughters. From this position of relative vulnerability, she maneuvered deftly, entering into a clandestine alliance with Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor. Their plan: to unite the warring houses of York and Lancaster through the marriage of Elizabeth of York to Henry Tudor. This union would ultimately bring about the end of the Wars of the Roses and establish the Tudor dynasty on the throne. Without Elizabeth Woodville's cooperation, the legitimacy of Henry VII's claim would have been far weaker. Though seldom credited as a founder of the Tudor dynasty, her role was instrumental. Lady Margaret Beaufort herself, though never queen, held a similarly influential position and is often grouped with Dowager Queens due to her power and proximity to the throne. As the mother of Henry VII, Margaret did not simply fade into the background after her son's ascent. She retained a formal status akin to that of a Dowager Queen, styling herself "My Lady the King's Mother," and taking precedence over even Henry's wife, Elizabeth of York, at court. Margaret was deeply involved in matters of state, financial administration, and even the selection of key advisors. Her patronage of religious and educational institutions, most famously, the founding of Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, left a lasting cultural legacy. Though technically a noblewoman and not a queen dowager, her experience parallels their stories closely, showing how maternal influence could extend well beyond the birth of a king. Moving forward into the reign of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon presents a particularly complex case. After 2 decades as Henry's queen, Catherine was cast aside when Henry sought to annul their marriage to wed in Boleyn. Stripped of her title and banished from court, she was given the lesser designation of Princess Dowager of Wales, a reference to her earlier marriage to Henry's brother, Arthur. Yet even in disgrace, Catherine wielded considerable influence. She retained the loyalty of much of the English populace, who viewed her as the legitimate queen. She also remained a powerful figure in the European political scene, drawing support from her nephew, Emperor Charles V. Her steadfast resistance to the annulment and her refusal to accept any title other than Queen delayed Henry's remarriage and precipitated the English Reformation. It was Catherine's moral and symbolic authority, not any military or political leverage, that forced Henry to break with Rome to achieve his objectives. In this sense, she was a dowager queen who exercised influence through moral resistance and the invocation of international alliances. Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, represents a different kind of dowager influence. Though her marriage to Henry lasted only 6 months and was never consummated, and fared far better than many of her contemporaries. Upon the annulment, she was granted a generous settlement and was referred to as the king's sister. She maintained a cordial relationship with Henry and was often welcomed at court, and skillfully navigated her changed status, embracing her role as a neutral figure amid the factional rivalries that plagued the court. While she did not engage in overt political maneuvering, her continued presence at court and the respect she commanded from both the king and his children ensured her a degree of informal influence. Her example illustrates how dowager queens, or in her case, a former queen not officially widowed, could leverage their royal connection for personal security and subtle court influence. The story of Katherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife and widow, offers yet another angle on the dowager queen's role. After Henry's death in 1547, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to the new king, Edward VI. As a dowager queen, she had access to wealth, status, and household staff. She acted as a mentor and educator to the young Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, and helped shape her early intellectual development. Catherine's household was a hub of reformist and humanist thought. She was an author in her own right, writing religious texts that promoted Protestant values. Her marriage to Seymour, though ultimately disastrous, revealed the precariousness of a dowager queen's position. Her death in childbirth in 1548 ended her active role, but the impact she had on Elizabeth and on the Protestant education of royal women endured. The dowager queens of Tudor England operated within a framework that often limited women's formal political authority. Yet these women repeatedly found ways to assert influence. They did so through their roles as mothers, educators, and religious patrons. They maintained networks of loyalty that transcended the reign of their husbands. Often, they acted as stabilizing forces, particularly during times of dynastic uncertainty. Their experience and maturity were valuable assets, particularly in a court environment that often prized youth and beauty but needed wisdom and continuity. One reason dowager queens are so often overlooked in Tudor narratives is the dramatic nature of the reigns they were part of. The Tudor era is marked by seismic religious upheaval, brutal executions, flamboyant personalities, and shifting alliances. In such a high-stakes environment, the quieter forms of influence wielded by dowager queens do not always make for sensational storytelling. Moreover, historical records often reflect the biases of male chroniclers and political figures who dismissed or downplayed the agency of women. As a result, the contributions of dowager queens were frequently relegated to the margins or viewed through the lens of their relationships to more dominant male figures. And yet, without their interventions, the history of the Tudor dynasty would look quite different. From arranging marriages to securing dynastic legitimacy, from educating future monarchs to holding together fragmented political factions, dowager queens were indispensable. Their unique position, imbued with royal authority but freed from the constraints of wifely duty, allowed them to wield influence in a more flexible and, in some ways, more impactful manner than they could while queen consort. They also serve as a valuable lens through which to examine gender and power in early modern England. The dowager queen's ability to exert influence was not based on military might or legal authority but on a deep understanding of court politics, strategic family alliances, and public perception. In this sense, they embodied a form of soft power that contrasts sharply with the more direct, often violent tactics employed by male courtiers and monarchs. Their survival and, in many cases, their success depended on their ability to navigate this treacherous landscape with intelligence, discretion, and resilience. This untold story invites us to reconsider the traditional boundaries of political power in Tudor England. It challenges the assumption that women's roles were strictly domestic or ceremonial. It reminds us that influence does not always wear a crown or sit on a throne. The dowager queens, in their many forms, contributed to the shaping of Tudor England in ways that were subtle but far-reaching. They were not merely the footnotes of their husbands' reigns or the relics of past power. They were, in their own right, power players hidden in plain sight. Their legacy is also one of continuity. In a dynasty marked by instability, short reigns, and abrupt changes in direction, dowager queens represented a bridge between generations. They carried forward traditions, mentored heirs, and provided a sense of consistency amid upheaval. In doing so, they helped sustain the very institution that often tried to sideline them. To understand the Tudor era without considering the Dowager Queens is to miss a vital piece of the puzzle. They deserve a place not just in the margins of Tudor history, but at its very heart. Their stories speak to the complexities of power, gender, and survival in one of the most dynamic periods of English history. They remind us that influence can take many forms, and that those who shape history are not always those who wear the crown. By bringing their stories to light, we enrich our understanding of the Tudor world and give voice to those whose power was real, if not always recognized. In the intricate party of politics, courtly power, and dynastic survival that characterized Tudor England, the Dowager Queens, widowed consorts of former monarchs, emerged as subtle but formidable power players. Though their husbands' deaths might have marked the official end of their queenship, their influence often endured, adapting to the changing tides of royal favor and political fortune. Rather than receding quietly into retirement, many Dowager Queens found new avenues through which to exert influence. These were not accidental or incidental contributions. They were the result of deliberate strategies, honed through years of experience at court, shaped by personal ambition, and guided by a profound understanding of power's many faces. These women understood that in a world where titles could be lost overnight and where proximity to the throne often determined survival, legacy and influence were their most potent weapons. One of the key strategies used by Dowager Queens to maintain influence was the careful orchestration of strategic marriages and alliances. Marriage in this period was far more than a personal or romantic affair. It was a tool of diplomacy, a means to secure property, legitimacy, and allegiance. Dowager Queens, who had themselves navigated the complex terrain of royal marriage, were often deeply involved in the planning and negotiation of marital unions for their children and kin. Their own experience made them shrewd judges of character, and their intimate knowledge of court politics allowed them to identify advantageous matches that could strengthen their family's position. Elizabeth Woodville, for instance, remains a striking example of a Dowager Queen who used marital alliances to preserve and extend her family's power. After the death of her husband, Edward IV, her sons were taken into custody and ultimately disappeared, presumably murdered in the Tower of London. Left politically vulnerable, Elizabeth turned to her daughter Elizabeth of York as the means by which to rebuild. The proposed marriage between Elizabeth and Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, was not merely a personal union but a dynastic masterstroke. This alliance united the houses of York and Lancaster, effectively ending the Wars of the Roses and founding the Tudor dynasty. It also restored her family to a position of prestige and influence. Though her own power would wane under the new regime, her daughter became queen, and her grandchildren would inherit the throne. Similarly, Margaret Beaufort, though not technically a queen dowager, wielded her maternal influence in much the same way. Her lifelong ambition was to see her son Henry Tudor crowned king, and she worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure this goal. She arranged alliances with disaffected nobles, cultivated international support, and, crucially, negotiated the marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York. Once her son ascended the throne, Margaret's position as the king's mother gave her unique access to the centers of power. She used this access to continue influencing court politics, carefully orchestrating the marital futures of her extended family to reinforce the Tudor hold on power. Her efforts were methodical and deeply strategic. Each move was designed to create a network of loyal allies across England's volatile noble class. Dowager Queens also retained influence through their intimate connections to the royal court. Having once been at the very center of power, they understood its mechanisms better than most. Even when officially removed from the court's formal hierarchy, they often remained physically close to the centers of power, sometimes residing in royal palaces or maintaining large, independent households that attracted courtiers and petitioners. These households often served as informal power centers, places where decisions were made, where alliances were brokered, and where reputations were built or destroyed. Catherine of Aragon's experience reflects this dynamic well. After being forced to relinquish her title and separate from King Henry VIII, she was exiled from court and given the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. Yet her status as a former queen, and her unshakable claim to that identity, continued to attract supporters. Her household became a site of quiet resistance to the new religious and political order. Nobles and clergy who were uncomfortable with Henry's break from Rome gravitated toward her, seeking her moral authority and symbolic leadership. She maintained correspondence with foreign powers, particularly with her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, using her familial connections to press diplomatic pressure on Henry. Even though she was politically marginalized, she remained a symbol of Catholic legitimacy and opposition to the king's new marriage. Her endurance in the face of personal and political humiliation speaks to the enduring influence a dowager queen could wield through her courtly connections. Another way that dowager queens exercised influence was through their wealth and control of resources. Upon the death of their husbands, dowager queens were often entitled to considerable dower lands, revenues, and titles. Though these rights could be challenged or curtailed by reigning monarchs, especially in times of political tension, they nonetheless offered dowager queens a foundation of independence. Wealth granted them the ability to maintain households, reward loyalty, sponsor religious and educational institutions, and support family members. It also allowed them to act as patrons of the arts, of clergy, and of reform movements, thereby extending their legacy far beyond the confines of their official roles. Katherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, provides a particularly compelling illustration of how a dowager queen could use her resources to shape political and cultural events. After Henry's death, she retained the title of Queen Dowager and was granted a generous settlement. She used her resources to establish a household that became an important center of learning and Protestant reform. Young Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I, lived under her care for a time and was likely deeply influenced by her education there. Catherine's household included leading reformist thinkers, and her published religious writings helped to promote the emerging Protestant ideology in England. Her marriage to Thomas Seymour after Henry's death brought her into a dangerous political game, and ultimately her influence was curtailed by his recklessness. Yet her legacy as a patron, author, and mentor endured. Her use of her dowager status to foster intellectual and religious reform contributed meaningfully to the cultural fabric of the Tudor era. Anne of Cleves, despite being only briefly married to Henry VIII and despite never officially holding the title of Queen Dowager, offers another model of strategic adaptation and influence. After the annulment of her marriage, Anne received a generous settlement including several estates, residences, and a lifelong income. She was welcomed at court, retained a measure of royal status as the king's sister, and cultivated relationships with Henry's children. She managed her estates efficiently and became a respected figure within the noble community. Her ability to remain neutral amid court intrigues allowed her to maintain her influence quietly but securely. She demonstrated how wealth and status, if wisely managed, could provide a platform for lasting security and informal power. The effectiveness of these strategies, marital alliances, courtly connections, and economic resources depended in large part on the personal qualities of the dowager queens themselves. They had to be politically astute, emotionally resilient, and socially adept. They often navigated shifting alliances, treacherous factions, and patriarchal constraints that sought to limit their authority. Their influence was rarely direct or overt. Instead, it was exercised through relationships, persuasion, and carefully calculated acts of loyalty or defiance. They operated in the shadows of thrones, yet their actions had consequences that reverberated through the halls of power. These women also had a keen sense of legacy. They understood that influence was not merely about the present, but about the future, about securing their children's inheritance, shaping the ideological and religious direction of the country, and ensuring that their own names were remembered with dignity and honor. Through their patronage of religious institutions, their support for educational reforms, and their strategic deployment of familial ties, dowager queens laid the foundations for future generations. They did not merely react to events, they shaped them. Dowager queens, then, were not relics of a bygone age once their husbands died. They were adaptable, strategic actors who leveraged their unique positions to maintain and even expand their influence. Their power came not from formal titles or military might, but from a sophisticated understanding of human relationships, institutional structures, and public perception. They moved through the corridors of power with caution and grace, knowing that their greatest asset was often their ability to endure, to watch, and to act at the opportune moment. In Tudor England, where the stakes of political misstep were often deadly, dowager queens demonstrated a remarkable capacity for survival. They navigated personal tragedies, public humiliations, and hostile regimes with a mixture of courage, pragmatism, and dignity. They remind us that influence is not always loud or visible. Sometimes, it is quiet and tenacious, built over years of careful maneuvering and sustained by a deep commitment to family, belief, and legacy. They also force us to reconsider traditional narratives of power. In histories dominated by kings, battles, and parliamentary acts, the contributions of women, especially widowed queens, are too often relegated to the background. Yet the dowager queens of the Tudor era challenge this omission. Their stories reveal a more nuanced and inclusive picture of power in early modern England. They operated within and sometimes against the structures that sought to contain them. They influenced kings, shaped the future of dynasties, and played pivotal roles in religious and cultural transformations. Their ability to do so without formal authority is a testament to their intellect, determination, and strategic brilliance. By examining the ways Dowager queens maintained power and influence through marriages, courtly networks, and resource control, we gain a fuller, richer understanding of the Tudor world. These women were not simply survivors of their husbands' legacies. They were creators of their own. Their influence may have been hidden in plain sight, but it was no less real, no less consequential, and no less deserving of recognition in the grand tapestry of history. Margaret Beaufort's name may not always stand alongside the more flamboyant figures of Tudor England, but her influence on the birth and consolidation of the Tudor dynasty was as foundational as any monarch's. Though she never wore a crown nor reigned in her own right, Margaret was the mother of a king, the grandmother of another, and a relentless architect of one of the most enduring dynasties in English history. Her life was marked by personal suffering, political danger, and relentless ambition, but above all, it was defined by an unwavering commitment to her son Henry Tudor, and to the establishment of his royal lineage. In a world where women were seldom granted overt political authority, Margaret carved out a unique space for herself. She operated with discretion, intellect, and an uncanny sense of timing, building alliances, manipulating events, and positioning her family at the heart of England's future. Margaret's path to influence began under difficult circumstances. She was a descendant of the Beaufort family, the legitimized but barred from the throne line of the Lancastrian house. Born in 1443, her lineage made her both privileged and vulnerable in a time of dynastic civil war. At just 12 years old, she was married to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI. She gave birth to Henry Tudor at the age of 13, shortly after being widowed. That her only son survived infancy was a minor miracle given the perils of the time, and Margaret would spend the rest of her life fiercely defending and advancing his claim. Henry Tudor's road to kingship was neither straightforward nor secure. After the Lancastrian cause faltered, he spent much of his youth in exile in Brittany, far removed from the English court and its intrigues. During this time, Margaret remained in England, where she married a series of powerful men, most notably Thomas Stanley, later Earl of Derby, each time strengthening her political network and improving her ability to advocate for her son. Her marriages were not merely social conventions. They were calculated moves designed to keep her at the center of courtly power while navigating the perilous balance between Yorkist rulers and Lancastrian loyalists. Margaret's most remarkable political maneuver came in the late 1470 and early 1480, during the reign of Richard III. Following the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, sons of Edward IV, England was left without a clear Yorkist heir. Margaret saw a rare and fleeting opportunity to position her son as a unifying figure. In an unprecedented move, she negotiated an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV and mother of the missing princes. The two women, previously on opposing sides of the dynastic divide, agreed that if Henry Tudor were to invade and succeed, he would marry Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. This agreement would form the foundation of the Tudor claim to legitimacy. It was not merely the alliance itself that demonstrated Margaret's shrewdness, but the way she orchestrated the necessary political groundwork. She leveraged her marriage to Thomas Stanley, a man with enormous political and military clout, convincing him to delay committing his forces until the outcome of the Battle of Bosworth was all but certain. Stanley's defection at a critical moment helped secure Henry's victory over Richard III. Margaret had not only manipulated her son into contention for the crown, she had helped ensure his victory on the battlefield without ever stepping onto it herself. Her reward was not merely the satisfaction of seeing her son crowned Henry VII, but a new, unparalleled status in the English court. Once Henry became king in 1485, Margaret's influence only grew. Unusually for the time, she styled herself as "My Lady the King's Mother," a title that acknowledged both her maternal authority and her exceptional position at court. She signed documents in her own name, maintained her own estates and household, and even took precedence over Queen Elizabeth of York on ceremonial occasions. Her involvement in the administration of the realm was extensive and sustained. She advised her son on legal and ecclesiastical matters, participated in the selection of court officials, and played a central role in overseeing financial affairs. Henry trusted her judgment implicitly, often turning to her on matters of dynastic importance. Margaret's influence extended far beyond day-to-day politics. She was a master of dynastic strategy, and her focus was always on the long-term stability of the Tudor line. She arranged marriages for her grandchildren that would strengthen the dynasty's European ties and secure peace with formerly hostile factions. Her role in negotiating the marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, for instance, was part of a broader effort to bind England to Spain, one of the most powerful nations in Europe. She understood that marriage was a tool of statecraft and wielded it with skill. Beyond her direct political activities, Margaret also shaped the Tudor legacy through her patronage of education and religion. A devout woman, she was committed to the reform of the Church and the promotion of learning. She endowed 2 colleges at Cambridge University, Christ's College and St. John's College, which remain prominent institutions to this day. Her support for scholars and theologians contributed to the intellectual flowering of the early Tudor period. This patronage was not merely philanthropic, it was ideological. By promoting learning and religious reform, Margaret was helping to shape the cultural values of the Tudor court. She wanted a dynasty that was not only powerful but also morally upright and intellectually advanced. At court, Margaret navigated a complex environment filled with rival factions, personal ambitions and shifting loyalties. She maintained her influence by cultivating a reputation for integrity, piety, and discretion. She rarely acted overtly or impulsively. Instead, she used her extensive network of allies to advance her goals indirectly. This allowed her to operate effectively even when her direct power was constrained. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. Her political success was built not on confrontation but on negotiation, persuasion, and persistence. One of the most striking aspects of Margaret's role was her ability to balance her public and private identities. She was at once a mother, a widow, a noblewoman, and a political operator. She used each of these roles to her advantage. As a mother, she inspired fierce loyalty in her son. As a widow, she was free from the direct control of a husband. As a noblewoman, she had access to the highest circles of power. And as a political operator, she used all these roles to achieve a singular aim: the establishment and survival of the Tudor dynasty. Her legacy is perhaps most powerfully felt in the reign of her grandson, Henry VIII. Though Margaret died in 1509, just 2 months after her son, her influence lingered. The institutions she supported, the alliances she forged, and the political structures she helped establish formed the bedrock of the Tudor state. Her emphasis on education and order helped shape the court of her grandson, who, though more autocratic and flamboyant, built upon the centralized power that Margaret had helped her son secure. Margaret Beaufort was not a queen, but she was every bit a sovereign force in her own right. She wielded power in the only ways available to a woman in her position with intelligence, subtlety, and resolve. She understood the nature of court politics better than many of her male contemporaries and managed to exert lasting influence without ever threatening the authority of the king she had worked so hard to enthrone. Her life was a testament to the idea that political influence does not always wear a crown, and that dynasties are built not only by those who sit on the throne but also by those who stand just behind it, guiding, advising, and ensuring their survival. In Margaret's story, we see the power of long-term vision. She did not seek glory for herself, nor did she act from momentary impulse. Her every move was calculated, her every alliance chosen with care. She played the long game, knowing that her own status mattered less than the future she was building for her son and his descendants. In an age when female power was circumscribed by custom and law, Margaret Beaufort expanded its boundaries through sheer force of will. Her life also exemplifies the complexities of female agency in a patriarchal society. She never led troops, never sat in council as an official ruler, and yet her influence was profound. She occupied a space between the formal structures of power and the informal networks of influence. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a political actor in Tudor England. Her strategies: quiet diplomacy, alliance building, control of estates, religious patronage, and maternal authority became a model for other women seeking to navigate the dangerous waters of court life. Perhaps most of all, Margaret Beaufort's life demonstrates that dynastic success is not merely a matter of seizing power, but of sustaining it. It is not enough to win a crown, one must also secure a legacy. Through her efforts, Henry VII founded a new dynasty on a shaky claim and an uncertain battlefield. Through her guidance, that dynasty took root, flourished, and came to define an era. Margaret ensured that the Tudors were more than a momentary solution to a civil war. She ensured they were a lasting answer to England's longing for stability, legitimacy, and order. To examine the Tudor dynasty without acknowledging Margaret Beaufort is to ignore the very foundation upon which it stood. Her fingerprints are found in its creation, its ideology, its diplomacy, and its succession. She was, in many ways, the dynasty's true matriarch, not only the mother of a king but the mother of an age. Her life, shaped by both personal devotion and political ambition, illustrates the extraordinary impact a woman could have even when she was expected to remain in the background. Margaret Beaufort did not remain in the background. She moved through the halls of power with quiet determination, and history has not forgotten the dynasty she helped build. Catherine of Aragon's life remains one of the most poignant and dramatic narratives of the Tudor era, marked by resilience, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to duty that spanned decades. As daughter of Spain's powerful monarchs, wife of England's King Henry VIII, and the first wife of the future King Edward VI, her life encompassed a personal and political journey full of triumphs and tragedies. Although officially cast aside after Henry's annulment, Catherine retained an undeniable influence throughout the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, profoundly shaping English Catholicism and altering the course of history. Her legacy, woven into the tapestry of Tudor England, speaks of faith, identity, and resolute moral authority. From the outset of her marriage to Henry VIII in 1509, Catherine's position was one of prestige, political alliance, and deeply held religious conviction. Representing a bond between England and the powerful Spanish Habsburg Empire, her marriage embodied both personal and state ambitions. She adapted gracefully to English life and culture, investing what she considered her rightful queenly role-bearing heirs, patronizing education and religion, and fostering devotion to Catholic orthodoxy. But it was not until after Henry's desperation for a male heir that Catherine's quiet strength became unmistakably clear, defining not only her own destiny but the course of English history. When Henry's frustrations with her inability to provide him a surviving son, only a daughter, Mary, reached a political boiling point, he sought to nullify their marriage in 1527. In defiance, Catherine refused to relinquish the role of queen or the title Queen of England. She guarded her dignity and position with dignity and juridical acuity, arguing that marriage to Arthur, Henry's older brother, had been consummated, making her marriage to Henry valid according to canon law. Her emotional letter to the Pope, "To refuse me justice is to deprive me of life," echoed around Europe as a message of moral authority, reinforcing her stature as both a royal and a religious martyr. While Henry aggressively pursued an annulment, a project that would eventually fracture the English Church, Catherine did not vanish. She remained a visible symbol of the old faith, sheltered by loyal supporters and adherents to Rome. Her defiance purchased her both dignity and isolation, but never broke her resolve. Summoned to appear before a venial court in 1534, she delivered with composure a speech affirming her marriage and faith. When refused, she returned to Kimbolton Castle, her presence still enough to rally resistance to Henry's religious reforms. Even in enforced seclusion, stripped of title, lands, and royal household, Catherine retained her dignity, often writing to European princes and to the Pope. Her continuing insistence on her status as queen and her unwavering loyalty to Rome helped preserve the view, held by many Catholics, that Henry's church was schismatic and illegitimate. Catherine's influence was not limited to her own cause. Her firm resistance became a cornerstone of the developing English Catholic movement. At a time when Henry was dissolving monasteries and ordering clergy to swear the oath of supremacy, Catherine declared that she would rather die than live in the presence of one who was not my lawful husband. Though powerless to drive legislation, her defense of Catholic doctrine became a rallying point for English traditionalists, echoed in the writings of Thomas More, Bishop John Fisher, and others who resisted Henry's supremacy. Her personal sacrifice drew attention to the human costs of the Reformation, providing spiritual gravitas to the cause of English Catholics. Her influence also extended into the inner sanctum of the Tudor court, even after her exile. While officially retired to a private residence, she continued to receive envoys and loyal priests, maintaining a small but influential community devoted to prayer, scholarship, and devotion to the old faith. Through her correspondence with European powers, she leveraged international pressure against Henry's religious policies. To Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and Catherine's nephew, she remained a symbol of Habsburg legitimacy and Catholic unity. Her letters reinforced his defense of the papacy. Catherine's moral and dynastic stance thus became both a domestic and international rallying cry against Henry's break from Rome. When Henry died in 1547, Catherine's status remained unchanged, her marriage still declared invalid, her daughter Mary to succeed her married state rather than its marital legality. Nevertheless, the spirit of Catherine's resistance lived on. Though removed from court during Edward VI's reign, Religious policy sharply Protestant were nevertheless opposed by Catholic traditionalists who looked back to Catherine's stand as a model. The Marian reaction, the restoration of Catholicism under Mary I, can be traced in part to the example set by Catherine and those who defended her. Her daughter Elizabeth was compelled to reassert her own religious stance in the face of this firm Catholic identity, shaped in no small part by her mother's influence. Throughout Edward's reign, Queen Mary I of England howled at the fracturing of the English Church and the suppression of the old rite. Her decisive restoration of papal supremacy in 1553, her re-establishment of monasteries, and her brutal campaign against Protestant clergy, were not mere reversals of policy, but a final vindication of Catherine's cause. The roots of English Catholic revival lay in her unwavering refusal to acknowledge Henry's supremacy or to leave the communion of Rome. Although Mary was less politically adept, she based her legitimacy on her undiluted Catholic upbringing, inspired and infused by Catherine's years of struggle. Beyond politics and religion, Catherine's personal legacy shaped English culture and memory. She cultivated a reputation for piety, literacy, dignity, and sorrow, the virtuous widow bravely rejecting dishonor. Her letters, many sealed with prayers and love for Mary, highlight a mother's decades-long demand for justice, her maternal devotion emboldening her resistance. Her charitable foundations, friaries, hospitals stood until the Reformation dismantled them, yet earned her reputation as a queen of compassion. When Mary ascended the throne, she gifted Catherine's tomb in Peterborough Cathedral with prominent epitaphs and religious iconography, preserving her mother's symbolic place within Catholic memory and legitimizing her protest through architecture and ceremony. In the century that followed, Catherine's story became enshrined in English culture, literature, and identity. Her refusal to accept annulment, her steadfast loyalty to Mary and Catholicism, and her dignified bearing continued to inspire artists, writers, and political commentators. During the Counter-Reformation, English Catholic exiles reminded European courts that Catherine's story was not only a political struggle but a spiritual one, involving the sanctity of marriage, the legitimacy of royal power, and the moral responsibilities of kings. Despite efforts to overshadow her by Tudor propaganda or later Protestant historiography, Catherine's image endured. Even during Elizabeth I's long reign, when Protestant memorialization sought to minimize her influence, her portrait and narrative were carefully preserved in private collections and recusant manuscripts. She became a symbol of resistance against regal tyranny, a spiritual compass for those who believed that monarchy must be tempered by conscience and faith. It was in this symbolic resonance that of a wronged queen standing by her vows that her influence found immortality. Catherine of Aragon's story is testament to a queen's ability to influence long after her official marriage ends. Through personal resistance, religious witness, moral conviction, and family loyalty, she shaped events that would resonate through the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and beyond. Her influence in the development of English Catholicism, and her indirect role in Mary's ascension to the throne and the temporary restoration of the Old Faith, marks her as one of the most consequential figures of the Tudor age. Though stripped of titles, lands, and access to power, Catherine refused to yield. Her resistance to Henry's supremacy anchored the Catholic cause, reminding England and Europe that conscience, duty, and faith could challenge even kings. Her impact on the religious landscape of Tudor England cannot be overstated. She helped define what it meant to be a Catholic ruler, gave legitimacy to resistance, and placed spiritual fidelity at the heart of political legitimacy. Her legacy shaped the course of history not only by altering religious policy but by embedding in English identity a sense that personal conviction could stand against even the strongest of monarchs. She helped establish the principle that marriage is a sacred contract, not simply a political convenience, and that moral agency belongs to women too, even queens. In death as in life, Catherine of Aragon remained queen in truth if not in name, and her resilience became a beacon of spiritual authority long after her voice was silenced in political courts. Her tomb, her letters, her causes of canonization all reflect a woman who dared to defy a king, for the sake of faith, honor, and her daughter's inheritance. The story of Catherine of Aragon reminds us that power does not reside solely in crowns, thrones, or titles, but also in the actions of those who refuse to betray their principles. She reshaped dynasties without access to parliaments, shaped religion without wearing a mitre, and shaped history by standing firm when every structure of power conspired to erase her. Her resilience, spiritual, political, maternal, remains her most enduring legacy. It tells us that quiet defiance can reverberate more broadly than conquest, that submission to one's conscience can outlast even the sharpest sword, and that a widow's fidelity can shape the destiny of nations. In Tudor England, the role of the Dowager Queen extended far beyond her official status, transcending mere personal tragedy to shape the cultural, political, and social currents of the age. Though often sidelined in the traditional narrative overshadowed by their husbands and headline-making successors, their influence was deeply interwoven into the fabric of the realm. They worked quietly, strategically, and persistently to leave imprints on society, governance, religion, and gender norms. Their legacy is a testament to how those once perceived as sidelined can cast long-lasting shadows. Their influence spilled out from courtly chambers into the broader social and political life of the kingdom. Their actions reshaped the contours of power, nurtured new institutions, and subtly redefined women's roles in a patriarchal era. Their strategies and tactics, marital diplomacy, patronage, education, household management, public piety, and networks of loyalty created ripples that extended through generations. To grasp the true depth of the Tudor world, one must see how these women operated beyond the gloss of coronation and ceremony, grounding their legacies in substance that outlived their titles. A Dowager Queen's social imprint often began with the households she maintained after her husband's death. These were not retreat homes but microcosms of influence, where courtiers, petitioners, and pilgrims came seeking counsel, protection, or favor. Katherine Parr's household, for instance, became an intellectual salon, cultivating reformist thinkers, mentoring young nobility, and advancing Protestant scholarship. Through carefully curated staff, sermons, patronage of up-and-coming clergy, and sponsoring young wards, she extended her influence across social and religious spheres even after Henry VIII's death. Anne of Cleves, though never Queen Dowager in strict legal terms, put her generous settlement to use running efficient estates and did so with such dignity and hospitality that her home became a neutral site of mediation for court disputes, offering a rare haven in the volatile environment of succession politics. Dowager households provided stability in times of upheaval, functioning as centers for cultural and social continuity. Their openness to nonviolent forms of influence through letters, hospitality, sponsorship, and patronage gave them clout that was not fleeting or ceremonial, but deeply rooted in community, faith, and intellectual patronage. Their broader social influence also emerged through patronage. Across education, religion, and charity, these royal widows seeded institutions whose growth extended far beyond their lifetimes. Margaret Beaufort founded colleges at Cambridge, and the libraries and grants she established underwrote intellectual growth long after her own passing. Katherine Parr funded religious works that spread Protestant thought even under Edward VI's contentious regency. Their legacies lived on in endowments to hospitals, churches, grammar schools, in foundation of chapels, and in patronage of the arts and literature. These institutions shaped the social habits, religious eyes, and even the moral programming of generations of Englishmen. They brought charity into the local parish, advanced learning among commoners and gentry, and helped solidify confessional identities, all under the aegis of a queenly figure whose title had faded. Perhaps their most lasting social influence was exerted through marriage diplomacy. This was the realm where they expressed a shrewd understanding that dynastic stability could not rest on one generation. Catherine of Aragon and Margaret Beaufort alike orchestrated marriages to entrench alliances, cushion against bloodshed, and create family networks that bound nobles to the crown. Dynastic marriages reinforced land rights, social bonds, and political loyalty. The marriage of Elizabeth of York to Henry VII unified Yorkist and Lancastrian elites, forging a caste of Tudor loyalists. Margaret's negotiation of Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon tied England into the spine of continental politics. These unions had social consequences. They influenced property transmission, raised expectations of public service among the gentry, and provided symbolic models of cross-border unity. By shaping the social map of the realm, they anchored domestic peace in the bedrock of family alliances and belonging. The Dowager Queens also shaped the religious landscape of Tudor society in significant ways. Catherine of Aragon's steadfast Catholicism, even under threat of deprivation, emboldened resistant pockets of Catholic identity. Her household maintained mass, relic veneration, and religious instruction for Mary and her staff, preserving spiritual traditions during a time of mass dissolution. The connection Catherine forged between the English court and the papacy left a legacy of defiance later invoked by Mary I. Later on, Katherine Parr's promotion of evangelical texts helped normalize reformist ideas among the elite and clerical class. Her patronage shaped sermons, printed liturgies, devotional manuals, and even early English-language Bibles. These would become components of national religious identity under Edward VI and Elizabeth I. Without these dowager-driven foundations, confessional shifts might have been more abrupt, more contested, or less deeply rooted in institutional forms. Their legacy brought spiritual change into communal life, parish practice and learned discourse. Beyond their religious and dynastic influence, dowager queens shaped public perceptions of female dignity and maternal authority. They redefined power without power by using convention mourning attire, widow's veil, the privacy of household as political tools. By embracing the image of the grieving or moral widow, they gained a moral high ground to speak on larger matters of estate, marriage and faith. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to take the oath of supremacy was as much about her position as a woman justified by mercy as it was about doctrine. Her public statements on conscience made her a symbol for principled opposition. Katherine Parr's religious writings at once preached devotion and skillfully navigated censorship. Margaret Beaufort's famous motto, "Without counsel there is no wisdom," highlighted her role as the queenly elder guiding youthful sovereigns. By merging maternal prestige with public intellect, dowager queens moved public opinion and elite perception, flattening assumptions that women's authority expired with widowhood. Consider too how they shaped the political structures of the kingdom, not through seats in parliament, but through informal networks. Their relationship with local gentry, a chain of familiars who served as stewards, member of parliament, local justices, created social structures independent of direct royal decree. Letters of recommendation from a queen dowager could secure appointments and land grants for loyal servants. That arrangement allowed them to compile followings of men and women whose obedience was rooted not in patronage alone, but in gratitude, faith, and social expectation. Through such structures, they mediated the relationship between central government and its landed power base, tempering courtly factionalism through personal ties. These networks endured even when political winds shifted and some of the individuals they sponsored would rise to positions of national importance, carrying the dowager's ethos of stewardship with them. Even ceremonial and cultural life was touched by their example. Their tombs, monumental in cathedrals or modest in rural chapels, became pilgrimage sites, resting places for dynastic memory. Their portraits hung in great halls, their poetry and dedications circulated in manuscript. By commissioning artistic works, choir books, embroidered vestments, tapestries, they shaped visual culture and aesthetics. These were not luxury items, but means of projecting dynastic identity, maternal virtue, queenly continuity, moral rectitude. They normalized public forms of female mourning that carried political meaning. Their public markers upheld their influence in communal spaces long after they passed. Their influence reached parishioners, schoolchildren, clerics, and nobility alike. Their strategies and tactics themselves became templates for future generations of aristocratic women. The careful cultivation of widows' rights, the use of dower lands for building schools or reformist churches, the subtle diplomacy at court, the use of matrimony to forge alliances all became staples of highborn widowhood. Continental scholars noted the English custom of queen's dowry schools, and piped it back into the elite conversation across Europe. Protestant writers later invoked Katherine Parr as an example of how women could write, teach, and publish piously without endangering social order. Margaret Beaufort's mother of a king image remained the ideal for royal women in subsequent reigns. Their tactics of quiet network building, indirect advocacy, historical patronage, and generational envisioning became part of a broader cultural grammar of power. The legacy of the dowager queens of Tudor England extends into four deeply intertwined realms that shaped the cultural, social, religious, and political fabric of the period. Culturally and intellectually, these women laid the groundwork for humanist education, encouraged the creation of devout literature, and promoted both religious contemplation and charitable practices. Socially, they provided stability and influence at the local level through their extensive households, strategic patronage, marital alliances, and acts of material generosity, anchoring traditions of law, landholding, and marriage within the county psyche. Religiously, they played a pivotal role in sustaining traditional forms of piety, offering resistance to Reformation-era changes while also contributing to the development of a moderate or Catholic-inflected English spirituality. Politically, the dowager queens helped shape a memory of female participation in dynastic affairs, transforming widowhood into a recognized and respected form of political agency and voice within the Tudor order. Their tactics, marriage diplomacy, public mourning, patronage, property management, network cultivation left a template for female influence that was subtle, indirect, yet powerful and durable. Widowed but not diminished, these women helped build the world that followed them by embedding their ideals into the institutions of church, school, charity, and family. Their shadows lie everywhere in Tudor England and beyond, in the stones of universities they endowed, the parish churches they built, the memorials they left behind, the grand alliances they forged and the moral authority they wielded as mothers, widows, and queens. In looking beyond their shadows, we see the clear outlines of a legacy not defined by crowns, but by counsel, not by direct rule but by social transformation, not by fame but by staying power. Their lasting mark on England was far greater than a throne. It was a culture of precedent, of possibility, and of feminine power woven into the tapestry of the realm itself. The legacy of the Dowager Queens of Tudor England is not confined to the dusty pages of court records or the confines of royal palaces. It is found instead in the deep, often understated, influence they exerted across generations through family, faith, governance, and social order. These women, frequently relegated to the margins of power once their husbands died, found ways to expand the role of queenship beyond the crown. They exercised influence not through titles, but through intelligence, strategy, and a profound sense of duty to the kingdom, their children, and their conscience. Their lasting impact comes from how they turned supposed limitations, widowhood, lack of formal authority, the constraints of gender into opportunities to mold the very structure of English society. In a period dominated by patriarchal values, where female power was scrutinized and often distrusted, Dowager Queens challenged norms not by breaking them outright, but by mastering the tools available to them. They demonstrated that power could take many forms: the management of vast estates, the selection of a daughter's husband, the appointment of clergy and household staff, or the strategic support of intellectual and religious movements. These were not mere domestic acts, but calculated political gestures with long-term ramifications. Through their patronage, they created networks of loyalty that spanned regions, generations, and confessional divides. The scholars they sponsored, the clerics they supported, and the servants they trained often rose to positions of considerable influence, carrying forward the vision and values these women had quietly instilled. Consider the enduring cultural contributions they made. Dowager Queens preserved and advanced traditions of female literacy and education. They were often deeply involved in translating texts, supporting schools, and encouraging the publication of religious and moral literature. In doing so, they not only enriched the intellectual climate of their own time, but laid foundations for a more literate and theologically engaged society. Their support of the arts, music, and architecture helped shape the aesthetic sensibilities of the period and reinforced messages of dynastic legitimacy and piety. Katherine Parr, for example, left behind religious writings that shaped Protestant devotional culture, while Margaret Beaufort's support for Cambridge University ensured the continued cultivation of humanist thought. These were not ephemeral contributions, they were acts of cultural institution building, designed to endure. Moreover, Dowager Queens exerted influence by remaining symbols of continuity in times of upheaval. They acted as anchors during periods of transition, when new monarchs were untested or unpopular, and when the realm was uncertain of its direction. Their presence reassured subjects that the monarchy was more than the whims of a single sovereign. It was an enduring institution held together by tradition, family, and moral authority. Margaret Beaufort's role during the early years of Henry VII's reign is an exemplary case. As mother of the new king, she lent him legitimacy and provided him with critical political support during a time of instability. Her careful guidance, discreet yet decisive, helped transform a fragile dynasty into one of the most enduring in English history. This continuity was especially critical in a time of religious upheaval. The English Reformation, with its oscillating tides of Catholicism and Protestantism, divided families, communities, and institutions. Dowager Queens became both protectors and shapers of religious identity. Catherine of Aragon's unwavering Catholicism provided inspiration and moral support for traditionalists, while Katherine Parr's evangelical sympathies gave hope to reformers. Their households became religious microcosms, safe spaces for clerics, scholars, and devout followers to gather, worship, and develop ideas. These informal religious communities had ripple effects far beyond the walls of the Queen's residences. They shaped the tone and direction of broader religious debates, lending weight to certain interpretations of Scripture and models of piety. Beyond matters of religion and governance, the social strategies of Dowager Queens influenced the very structure of noble and royal life. Their approach to widowhood redefined female agency in late medieval and early modern England. Rather than receding from public life, many of them used widowhood as a platform to assert independence and demonstrate stewardship. They oversaw large estates, engaged in philanthropy, and took on guardianship roles for future monarchs or heirs. In doing so, they modeled a vision of noble womanhood that was active, responsible, and socially engaged. Their lives challenged assumptions about a woman's usefulness after childbearing age or after the death of a spouse. By proving that they could contribute meaningfully to the governance and well-being of the realm, they expanded the social and political roles available to women of their status. What makes their legacy so powerful is that it was not always rooted in dramatic confrontation or overt revolution. These women often worked quietly in the shadows of kings and counselors, yet their impact was no less profound. They understood the mechanics of court politics, the power of kinship ties, and the value of strategic silence just as well as they did public persuasion or open resistance. Their effectiveness came not from slowing systems, but from bending them subtly, persistently, and often permanently. They exercised a kind of soft power long before the term existed, proving that authority could be built from influence, not only from command. And it is precisely because they did not always seek the limelight that their contributions have so often been overlooked. Traditional histories of the Tudor period tend to focus on kings and ministers on wars, legislation, executions, and treaties. But behind many of those headline events were the long-range plans, the financial underpinnings, or the diplomatic advice of a dowager queen. Their involvement may have been discreet, but it was not peripheral. They were central to how dynasties were preserved, how crises were managed, and how legitimacy was projected. Their legacy can also be seen in the generations that followed. The memory of Margaret Beaufort lingered well into the reign of Elizabeth I, often cited as a paragon of maternal virtue and political sagacity. Catherine of Aragon was invoked by Catholic loyalists long after her death, her image serving as a symbol of religious constancy and righteous resistance. Katherine Parr's writings continue to be read and reprinted, inspiring generations of Protestant women. Even Anne of Cleves, though often dismissed by contemporaries, demonstrated through her survival and successful negotiation of postmarital life how intelligence and dignity could secure a stable future. Ultimately, the enduring power of dowager queens lay not in their titles, which were often revoked or contested, but in their influence, which was more difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. They shaped policy through counsel, nurtured religious and educational movements, stabilized royal households, and built legacies that outlasted any reign. They defied the narrow roles prescribed to them and in doing so, opened new possibilities for women in power. Their lives remind us that history is not only shaped by those who rule from thrones but also by those who work behind them, often unseen, but never uninvolved. The Dowager Queens of Tudor England stand as enduring figures of strength, adaptability, and wisdom. Their stories deserve greater attention not because they are anomalies, but because they represent a broader truth, that power, when exercised with patience and purpose, can transcend official roles. They taught future generations that even from the shadows, one could shape the destiny of a nation. Through their lives, we see how resilience, strategy, and moral conviction can echo through time silently at first, then resoundingly as history comes to recognize the full extent of their contributions. Their legacies remain etched in the institutions they built, the values they upheld, and the social structures they helped to sustain. They remind us that the end of a reign need not mark the end of influence and that sometimes, the most lasting power lies in what is left behind.